Tokyo, late 1989. The skyline glows with money. From Ginza to Shinjuku, champagne flows like tap water, and Ferraris line the curbs. To be young and rich in Japan is to be unstoppable, the world's envy, the miracle made real. In those years, Japan wasn't just another country, it was the future. Its companies dominated global markets. Sony ruled electronics. Toyota had redefined manufacturing, and Toshiba was a technological titan. The Western world whispered of a coming Japan century. But beneath the neon lights, something dangerous was foaming. A mirage of endless wealth, and the illusion that prosperity could never end. This is the story of that illusion, and what happens when a society built on confidence forgets how to imagine failure. The story begins not with collapse, but triumph. After the devastation of World War II, Japan rebuilt at breathtaking speeds. With American aid, a disciplined workforce, and a government guided by bureaucratical vision, Japan transformed from ashes to a superpower in just 3 decades. By the 1980s, its GDP was second only to the United States. Its exports flooded the world. VCRs, microchips, cars, cameras, all stamped made in Japan. Economists coined a phrase for it, the Japanese miracle. But this miracle wasn't magic. It was policy. The government's Ministry of International Trade and Industry, known simply as MITI, carefully guided investments supporting promising industries while shielding them from foreign competition. Banks funneled cheap credit to corporations, fueling innovation and expansion. For years, it worked flawlessly, but success breeds arrogance. And by the late 1980s, Japan's policymakers began to believe that the rules of economic gravity no longer applied. In 1985, something happened that would change everything. The Plaza Accord. The US, frustrated by its trade deficit, pressured Japan and other allies to strengthen their currencies against the dollar. The yen's value surged overnight, a blow to Japan's export-led economy. To soften the pain, Japan's central bank, the Bank of Japan, cut interest rates. Money became cheap, too cheap. Corporations borrowed heavily. Landowners watched their property values skyrocket. Stock traders flooded the index with speculative cash. And suddenly, Tokyo's land was worth more than all the real estate in the United States combined. In Ginza, 1 square meter of land sold for over $200,000. The grounds of the Imperial Palace were said to be worth more than all of California. These numbers weren't just ridiculous, they were intoxicating. Executives used stock shares as collateral for more loans, which they used to buy more stocks, pushing prices even higher. It was, in a sense, a bubble, not of technology or innovation, but of belief. Politicians didn't want the party to end. The ruling Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, in power since 1955, saw the boom as validation, proof that Japan's unique system of bureaucratical guidance, lifetime employment, and consensus-based capitalism was superior to the West's cutthroat markets. Prime Minister Noboru Takeshita toasted to a new era of Japanese leadership. But in truth, the government had become addicted to the illusion of control. Warnings came from within and abroad that the economy was overheating, but rising interest rates risked slowing growth, and no politician wanted to be the one to puncture the dream. So they waited, they borrowed, and spent. Every ordinary citizen joined the frenzy. Housewives speculated on stocks between grocery runs. Teenagers bragged about futures portfolios. Office workers mortgaged family homes to buy tiny apartments they never live in. In the words of one trader, it felt like God wanted Japan to be rich. But bubbles don't ask for permission to pop. December 29th, 1989, the Nikita stock index closed at 38,915 points, its highest in history. By following Christmas, it would lose nearly half its value. Over the next 3 years, Japan's real estate market collapses. Banks, suffering with bad loans, begin to panic. The assets that once made balance sheets shine are now worthless paper. And suddenly, the richest country in Asia is paralyzed by fear. The government hesitates. The Bank of Japan blatantly raises rates to cool speculation. Too late. Then it slashes them again. Too late again. The financial system begins to seize. Yet, on the streets, the fall is strangely quiet. There are no riots, no mass protest, only confusion and a kind of embarrassed silence. Because in Japan, stability is sacred, even when the foundations are crumbling. Through the early 1990s, officials insist that recovery is near. Newspapers print cautious optimism. But beneath the claim, a new word begins circulating in the business world. Zombie. Zombie companies, zombie banks. Corporations that should have gone bankrupt were kept alive by endless government bailouts and creative accounting. Bankers refused to write off loans. Doing so would expose the scale of their failure. Bureaucrats preferred denial to disaster. And so, Japan entered what economists would later call a balance sheet recession. A nightmare in which everyone stops spending, not because they're poor, but because they're afraid. Households saved. Companies hoarded cash. Investments froze. And deflation, falling prices, set in. It seemed harmless at first. After all, who complains when things get cheaper? But deflation feeds on itself. Lower prices mean lower profits, leading towards lower wages, leading to lower spending, and the cycle deepened. By 1993, Japan's growth rate was nearly zero. The miracle had become a memory. Economics is never just numbers. It's people. For millions of Japanese workers, the crash wasn't a single moment. It was the slow erosion of certainty, the promise of lifetime employment, once the foundation of Japan's social contract began to crack. Middle-aged salarymen who'd spent their lives with one company were quietly retired early. Graduates entering the workforce found job offers vanished. By the late 1990s, a term would emerge to describe them: the lost generation. An entire cohort who came of age in an era without growth. In Tokyo's Neon District, the mood turned inwards. Consumer confidence evaporated. Families stopped buying cars, homes, even new clothes. A generation that had believed in endless improvement now settled for survival. One sociologist called it the privatization of hope. By the mid-1990s, the world had moved on. The United States was in the middle of a tech boom. Europe was building the euro. Japan, once the model, had become a warning. And yet, it didn't collapse. The trains still ran on time. Crime stayed low. The social fabric held. But underneath that order was something fragile. The quiet despair of a nation that couldn't admit failure. A young official in the finance ministry would later describe it simply, "We lost 10 years, but really, we lost courage." That courage to reform, to risk, to reinvent would define the battle for a next decade, because the lost decade was only the beginning. It's 1992. Tokyo's skyline still glitters, but the lights feel colder now, more fluorescent than golden. The newspapers don't call it a crisis yet. Officially, Japan is experiencing a temporary correction, but deep down, everyone knows the party's over. The miracle that once dazzled the world has stalled. And as months turn into years, Japan discovers something far worse than collapse. It learns how to live in stagnation. In Western economies, recessions arrive with noise. Markets crash, politicians scramble, people protest. In Japan, a downturn came quietly. Factories still ran, shops still opened, trains still glided in on time. But the numbers told a different story. By 1993, Japan's GDP growth had fallen to near zero. Industrial production declined, exports weakened, and the Nikkei stock index, once near 39,000, hovered at barely 15,000. Yet politicians refused to call it a recession. They were terrified, not just of panic, but of shame. For decades, Japan's success had been its identity. To admit failure wasn't just economic, it was existential. And so, the government spoke in euphemisms: adjustment period, economic cooling, structural realignment. The public nodded politely, but the confidence, that invisible fuel of every economy, had evaporated. At the heart of the crisis lay Japan's banks. During the bubble years, they lent recklessly, not just to corporations, but to real estate developers, stock speculators, and anyone to claim to have connections. When the bubble burst, those loans turned toxic. But Japan's system was built on relationships, not confrontation. Banks didn't foreclose or write down losses. They extended loans indefinitely, hoping time would heal the wounds. It didn't. By 1995, Japan's financial system resembled a glacier. Vast, solid, and utterly immobile. Economists began using a haunting term: zombie banks. They weren't dead, but they weren't alive either, surviving only through government support and accounting tricks. And because these banks couldn't fail, new ones couldn't rise. Small businesses couldn't get credit. Innovation froze. Investment died. It was the worst kind of recession, one that looked calm, but hollowed out everything inside. For nearly 4 decades, the Liberal Democratic Party had ruled Japan with quiet dominance. A revolving door of gray-suited leaders, backed by powerful ministers and corporate donors. But now, the system was faltering. Public frustration grew. Corruption scandals erupted, from inside trading to bribery linked with construction contracts. In 1993, for the first time since 1955, the LDP lost power. A coalition of reformist parties briefly took control, promising to renew Japan's democracy. But unity proved fleeting. Within months, infighting tore them apart. And so, the old guard returned, weaker, more cynical, but still in charge. Prime ministers came and went in rapid succession, each pledging reform. each undone by bureaucracy and factionalism. It was governance by inertia. One political scientist called it a democracy without decisions. January 17th, 1995, 5:46 a.m. A 6.9 magnitude earthquake strikes Kobe, one of Japan's largest port cities. More than 6,000 people die. Entire neighborhoods collapse. Fires rage through the winter morning. But what shocks the nation the most is not the quake itself, but the government's response. For days, chaos reigns. Relief supplies are delayed. Bureaucrats argue over jurisdiction. The self-defense forces hesitate to deploy without formal approval. Television images show survivors digging through rubble with bare hands while officials hold press conferences. It's a moment of collective disillusionment. Japan, the model of order, technology, and preparedness, suddenly looks helpless. Confidence in the government, already fragile, shatters. The illusion of bureaucratic competence, once Japan's pride, turns to bitterness. As one Kobe resident told a reporter, "We thought we were safe because we were Japanese. We were wrong." 2 months after Kobe, another blow hits the nation's psyche. March 20th, 1995, morning rush hour. Tokyo subways were packed. Members of a doomsday cult called Om Shrikyo release sarin gas in 5 trains. 13 people die. Thousands are injured. It's the worst act of domestic terrorism in Japan's modern history. And again, the system fails to respond swiftly. Confusion reigns. Police and paramedics struggle to coordinate. For a country built on the promise of safety, it's unthinkable. Suddenly, the cracks in Japan's carefully maintained order are visible to everyone. Economic stagnation, political decay, natural disasters, and now, spiritual collapse, all within months. 1995 becomes a year etched into Japan's collective memory, a turning point when faith in institutions truly begins to fade. Amidst the chaos, a quieter tragedy unfolds. The youth, graduates who entered the workforce in the early 1990s, face a brutal reality: hiring freezes, shrinking firms, and lifetime employment that no longer existed. Those who failed to find stable jobs early often never recover. They become the freeters, working part-time, temporary, or contract jobs. For a society built on hierarchy and career identity, it was devastating. Without stable income, marriage and family was postponed. Birth rates plummeted. And slowly, Japan began to age. By 1999, 1 in 5 citizens was over 60. The dependency ratio, the numbers of workers supporting retirees, began to tilt dangerously. The social contract that had powered Japan's miracle, work hard and the system will take care of you, was breaking down. And in its place grew something new: quiet resignation. A novelist from the era described it perfectly. We live in a country where tomorrow looks like yesterday, only more so. By late 1990s, the situation had become untenable. The Bank of Japan had slashed interest rates to near zero. The government spent trillions of yen on public works, bridges, tunnels, roads to nowhere, to stimulate growth. But demand never returned. Economists outside of Japan began calling it the lost decade. Inside Japan, the term felt too generous, because even calling it lost implied that someday it would be found again. Prime Minister Ryuto Hashimoto attempted sweeping reforms in 1997: deregulation, tax restructuring, and fiscal discipline. But the timing was disastrous. Just as Japan tightened its budget, the Asian financial crisis hit. Exports collapsed, bank failures accelerated, and once again, reform gave way to retreat. By 1998, Japan was technically in the worst recession since World War II. In 1999, a new prime minister, Keizo Obuchi, took office. A gentle, soft-spoken man known for his empathy. Obuchi doubled down on stimulus, spending billions on construction and launching massive credit infusions to stabilize banks. It worked briefly. The stock market stabilized. Exports ticked up. Analysts spoke of green shoots. But then, tragedy struck again. In April 2000, Obuchi suffered a fatal stroke. His successor, Yoshihiro Mori, was widely viewed as impotent. The economy slipped back into stagnation. It was a cruel pattern Japan couldn't seem to escape. Recovery, relapse, denial. By the turn of the millennium, one truth became clear. Japan's problems weren't just economic, they were psychological. A nation that had once built the future now seemed afraid to imagine one. Yet, even in stagnation, seeds of change were growing. A younger generation, raised amidst uncertainty, began to question old certainties, lifetime work, corporate loyalty, conformity. Entrepreneurs, like Masayoshi Son at SoftBank, started to challenge Japan's cautious business culture. Artists and writers explored themes of isolation and identity, from Hakuyayi Makurumi surreal novels to the haunting minimalism of post-bubble cinema. In the cracks of the frozen decade, a new Japan was quietly forming. One more individualistic, more creative, but also more uncertain. The lost decade, for all its pain, was also a mirror, forcing Japan to confront what it truly was when the dream ended. It's 2001. Japan is calm, as always. The trains glide in on time. The vending machines are stocked. Neon still flicker through Shibuya's night. From the outside, it looks like stability. But look closer. Behind the polite smiles and tidy order lies something else. A quiet fracture in the nation's soul. The economy may have stalled, but the real damage was to the people. Because when a society's promises break, it doesn't shatter all at once. It cracks, piece by piece, in silence. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a new generation came of age. One that never knew prosperity. They were born too late to see Japan's bottom, but too early to benefit from globalization. Sociologists would later call them the lost generation. Their parents had believed in a single path. Study hard, enter a good company, serve it loyally for life. But that path no longer existed. Job security was gone. Wages stagnated. Employers turned to part-time and contract workers. Cheaper, disposable, and replaceable. A new societal class emerged. The fritters, short for free workers, young men and women drifting between low-wage jobs without benefits or future. In 1990, they were rare. By 2000, they made up nearly a quarter of Japan's workforce. To the older generation, they seemed lazy and ungrateful. But in truth, they were the victims of an economy that had quietly rewritten its rules. For many, the experience left deep scars. Not just financial, but personal. Because in Japan, your job is your identity. Without one, who are you? From this insecurity emerged a new phenomenon. One that would puzzle and alarm psychologists. Hikikomori, literally pulling inward. Young people who shut themselves away, not for weeks, but for years, refusing to leave their rooms, speak to family, or face society. By the early 2000s, Japan's Ministry of Health estimated over 1 million such cases. Parents left meals outside their doors. Curtains stayed drawn. Online worlds replaced real ones. It wasn't rebellion, it was retreat. A quiet protest against a system that offered no place to belong. A psychiatrist described it as a psychological scar left by economic failure. In a culture built on belonging, to withdraw was unthinkable. Yet thousands did, silently, unseen. The hikikomoris became the most haunted symbol of Japan's invisible crisis. While the young withdrew, the old multiplied. Japan's population was aging faster than any in human history. By 2005, nearly 1 in 4 citizens was over 65. By 2020, it would be 1 in 3. The miracle generation that had rebuilt Japan was retiring, and they were living longer than ever. But there wasn't enough young workers to replace them. The economy strained under pensions and healthcare costs. Rural towns emptied out as young fled to the cities. Some villages became known as ghost towns, their schools closed, their homes abandoned. Yet, in the midst of this decline, something deeply Japanese endured: dignity. Elderly volunteers continued working, cleaning parks, maintaining order. In one small town, retirees planted flowers along train tracks, saying, "Even if the train stops coming, the flowers will still bloom." It was a quiet defiance, the grace of a generation that refused to despair. For decades, Japan's social contract had been clear. Men worked, women married, raised families, and supported the home. But in the lost decades, that balance began to collapse. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, not as executives, but as part-timers. Marriage rates dropped. Birth rates plummeted to one of the lowest in the world. By the mid-2000s, the phrase "parasite singles" appeared in media, describing unmarried adults living with their parents. It was meant as an insult, but it masked a deeper truth. Independence had become economically impossible. The cost of living soared, wages stagnated, and young people delayed or abandoned family life. The result was demographic decline, a slow-motion implosion that economists called the demographic time bomb. Yet, out of it emerged new voices: feminist writers, artists, and activists challenging traditional roles, demanding a rethink of what it meant to live, to work, to belong. Change, as always in Japan, began not with protest, but with quiet perseverance. As the economy froze, imagination exploded. The 1990s and 2000s became the golden age of Japanese pop culture. Anime, manga, video games, all born from a generation escaping a stagnant reality. The surreal mediocrity of Neon Genesis Evangelion to haunt nostalgias of Spirited Away. The art of the lost decades reflected the nation's inner tension: beauty and despair, tradition and technology, hope and loss. Globally, Japanese culture became its most powerful export. Ironically, even as Japan's economy declined, its creativity influence grew. The world consumed its stories, its aesthetics, its dreams, even as the people who made them struggled with alienation. One critic once said, "Japanese pop culture is a mirror, bright on the outside, cracked underneath." Perhaps no symbol defined post-war Japan like the salaryman, the white-collared worker in a suit, commuting by early morning train, loyal to one company for life. By the early 2000s, that archetype was fading. Companies downsized. Overtime pay vanished. Middle management, once secure, faced layoffs. Yet, many refused to show weakness. Every morning, men in their 50s still boarded the train in suits, even after losing their jobs. Some spent their days sitting in parks or libraries, pretending to work, too ashamed to tell their families. Journalists called them the employment ghost. It was a tragedy of pride, a generation trapped by its own ideals. The work ethic that had built Japan's miracle now crushed those who lived by it. Amidst this disillusionment, new philosophies emerged. Minimalists gained popularity. The idea that happiness comes not from possession, but simplicity. Books like The Art of Tidy Up and Goodbye, things reflected a collective yearning to let go. Not just of clutter, but of the weight of lost expectations. Religion, long private in Japan, saw quiet revival. Young people turned to Buddhism, New Age spirituality, even foreign ideals, making meaning beyond material success. In Tokyo's tiny cafes, poets and thinkers spoke of slow life, a rejection of endless striving. It was perhaps Japan's greatest act of resilience, learning to find beauty in impermanence. By the mid-2000s, Japan had become a paradox, one of the safest, cleanest, most technologically advanced societies on Earth, yet also one of the loneliest. Social isolation reached new extremes. Marriage, friendships, even physical touch declined. A new industry emerged: rental relationships. Actors hired to pose as family members, friends, even romantic partners. It was both tragic and deeply human. A nation seeking connection in any form it could find. Sociologists called it the hollowing of society. But it was more than loneliness. It was a mirror held up to the world, showing what happens when prosperity forgets its purpose. And yet, Japan endures. Always. Through war, through defeat, through stagnation. What kept it alive was growth. It was grace. An unspoken resilience woven through daily life. In the quiet care of an elderly neighbor. The discipline of a commute queue. The beauty of cherry blossoms that bloom and fall, year after year. As one Tokyo professor said, we learn to live beautiful within decline. That too is strength. Japan's lost decade was not simply years of loss. They were a redefinition of what it means to survive. By the late 1990s, Japan's economic crisis had lasted nearly a decade. But behind the headlines of deflation and bankrupt banks lay something more corrosive: political stagnation. The government that had once overseen Japan's miraculous post-war rise had grown old, insular, and risk-averse. The bureaucracy that rebuilt the nation was now afraid of failure, and the people, weary of empty promises, had begun to lose faith in politics itself. This is the story of how Japan's leadership became trapped in indecision, and how the very structure of its political system made recovery almost impossible. For most of the post-war period, one political party dominated Japan: the Liberal Democratic Party, or LDP. Formed in 1955, the LDP wasn't truly liberal or democratic in the Western sense. It was a pragmatic coalition of factions, united mainly by the desire to stay in power. For decades, it worked. Japan's high-speed growth made everyone a little richer, and the public tolerated a cozy relationship between politicians, bureaucrats, and businesses. But by the 1990s, that system, often called the Iron Triangle, was breaking down. The ministries that once directed industrial policy were now paralyzed by fear of blame. Politicians promised reform, then they backed away. Business leaders clung to government favors. And behind it all, the same men shuffled in and out of office, their hands tied by party factions. Japan wasn't short on leaders, it was short on decisions. Between 1991 and 2001, Japan saw 9 different prime ministers, each promising renewal, each falling to internal rivalries and public disillusionment. There was Tokugawa Kaifu, a careful technocrat who couldn't push reform past bureaucratic resistance. There is Kiichi Miyazawa, the polished diplomat whose administration stumbled under scandal. And there is Muriori Hoshii, a brief symbol of hope, Japan's first non-LDP prime minister in nearly 40 years, who resigned amidst allegations of corruption after just 8 months. Each leader came in with energy, each left in frustration. The real power often lay elsewhere, in the ministries, in party factions, and in the behind-the-scenes network that tied politics to big business. One observer at the time quipped, "In Japan, the bureaucracy proposes, the politicians dispose, and the public supposes." Corruption scandals deepened the public cynicism. In 1992, the recruit scandal exposed how executives at major firms offered lucrative pre-IPO stock to politicians and bureaucrats. A quiet payoff for influence. The revelation shook Japan's confidence in the political elite. The Jinsen mortgage company crisis followed. Housing lenders tied to the banks that had failed spectacularly, costing taxpayers trillions of yen in bailout. Politicians blamed bureaucrats blamed banks, and the public blamed everyone. As trust evaporated, so did hope of decisive reform. The government's approach became one of half measures. Bailouts that were too small, stimulus packages that came too late. The phrase, Japan Inc., once a symbol of coordination and efficiency, now became shorthand for complacency and denial. Much of the paralysis stemmed from Japan's unique bureaucratic culture. The ministries, finance, trade and industry, construction, were filled with some of the brightest minds in the country. But their incentive was not innovation, it was preservation. Officials were judged not by their creativity, but by their ability to avoid scandal and maintain harmony. That meant deferring hard choices, like closing failing banks or allowing major corporations to fail. When one ministry proposed financial regulations, another would object. When one suggested cutting spending, the Diet demanded pork-barred projects. The result was what economists later called administrative cirrhosis, a system too rigid to respond to crisis. It wasn't that Japan didn't know what needed to be done, it was that no one could afford to take the blame for doing it. By the turn of the millennium, Japan's lost decade had stretched into 2. Unemployment, once unthinkable, reached record highs. The suicide rate climbed. Home values fell by half in some areas. The national debt ballooned to over 100% of GDP. And politically, the center was crumbling. Young voters no longer felt loyal to the LDP. They saw politics as distant, irrelevant, a theater of rituals rather than leadership. In 2001, one man promised to change that. Junichiro Koizumi, a charismatic maverick with a wild mane of gray hair and a flair for defiance, became prime minister in April 2001. He called himself an assassin of the old system. His slogan was simple: change Japan. Koizumi understood the power of media. He was telegenic, bold, and unafraid to pick fights, even within his own party. He promised to break the cozy ties between the LDP, bureaucrats, and big business. And for a time, it worked. His reforms, especially the privatization of Japan Post, one of the largest financial institutions in the world, symbolized a genuine accept to modernize. The public adored him. His approval rating soared above 80%. Even Koizumi's charisma couldn't overcome Japan's structural gridlock. His successors, Abe Furaku, also, each fell in turn. The bureaucracy reverted to form. Koizumi had lit the spark, but it was not enough to burn through decades of inertia. By the late 2000s, Japan's political paralysis had become chronic. The Democratic Party of Japan finally ousted the LDP in 2009, a historic moment. But even this victory brought no lasting change. The DPJ's leaders, too, were constrained by the same bureaucracy, the same rigid structure, the same fear of risk. When the global financial crisis hit, Japan's policymakers once again reached for familiar tools: stimulus, low interest rates, debt. It was survival, not transformation. As one political analysis wrote at the time, Japan's greatest tragedy is not failure, but the inability to move beyond it. And so, Japan entered the 21st century much as it had left the 20th, cautious, restrained, and deeply introspective. Its democracy functioned. Its society remained peaceful. But its politics, that vital engine of renewal, seemed trapped in amber. The lost decade was not simply an economic story. They were a political tragedy of institutions too stable to collapse, too rigid to evolve. Japan had survived, but it had lost something harder to measure than GDP. It had lost its momentum. By the dawn of the 21st century, Japan's lost decades were no longer just Japan's story. They were the world's mirror, a warning of what happens when growth becomes faith and debt becomes destiny. The Japanese disaster, as economists called it, was no longer confined to Tokyo. Around the world, policymakers studied Japan's mistakes with both fascination and fear. And yet, in time, many would repeat them. In the late 1990s, Japan's deflation had already reshaped the global conversation about economics. World economists, especially those in Washington and London, looked at Japan and saw a case study in what not to do. The Federal Reserve, the IMF, the World Bank, all dissected Japan's missteps. How it had waited too long to clean up bad bank loans. How it had used stimulus without reform. How it had cut interest rates to zero but failed to restore confidence. Paul Krugman, then a rising star in economics, coined a phrase that would echo for decades: liquidity trap. It meant that even with money flooding the system, nobody wanted to spend, borrow, or invest. The engine of capitalism had stalled, not for lack of fuel, but for lack of belief. Japan had become a laboratory of a new kind of recession, one that couldn't be fixed by traditional tools. Then came 2008, when the global financial crisis erupted. Housing markets collapsed, banks failed, credit freezing. Economists everywhere turned back to Japan. The world, it seemed, had entered its own lost decade. Central banks slashed interest rates to zero. Governments issued massive stimulus packages. Words once whispered in academic papers: deflation, quantitative easing, balance sheet recession, now filled the headlines. What Japan had lived through in 20 years, the world was about to experience together. But there was a difference. Japan had been alone. The rest of the world, from the US to Europe, could now coordinate responses, trade ideas, and act collectively. And they did something else too. They borrowed Japan's playbook. In March of 2001, the Bank of Japan had pioneered a radical experiment, quantitative easing, or QE. It was simple in theory. The central bank would buy government bonds, pump money directly into the financial system, and hope it would jolt the economy back to life. At the time, it was dismissed as desperate. Critics said it would never work. But when the US Federal Reserve faced its meltdown in 2008, Chairman Ben Bernanke remembered Japan. He had studied its failure closely, and he knew how slow Tokyo had been to act, how fear of inflation had paralyzed the banks of Japan for years. In 2012, Japan itself tried something bold, a second attempt at revival. Shinzo Abe, newly returned to the Prime Minister's office, promised to end 2 decades of stagnation with what he called 3 arrows of Abenomics: aggressive monetary easing, unleashing inflation to break the deflationary mindset, flexible fiscal policy, government spending to stimulate demand, structural reform, deregulation, labor reform, and opening Japan's markets. Abe's message was as psychological as it was economic. He wanted Japan to believe in growth again. For a while, it worked. Stock prices surged. The yen weakened, boosting exports. Corporate profits climbed. But deeper change, social reform, demographic renewal, gender equality, proved harder. The population was still shrinking. Productivity gains remained elusive. Abenomics, like so much of Japan's efforts, offered hope, but not salvation. Behind every policy failure lay a larger, slower crisis. Japan was aging faster than any nation in history. By the 2000s, more than 1 in 5 Japanese were over 65. By the 2020s, it'd be 1 in 3. The country's fertility rate had fallen far below replacement. Entire towns vanished. Schools closed for lack of children. Economists called it the demographic time bomb. With few workers and more retirees, Japan's economy faced permanent headwinds: slow growth, shrinking domestic demand, and rising healthcare costs. But the social consequences were just as profound. The loneliness became an epidemic. The term hikikomori, reclusive individuals who withdrew from society, entered global vocabulary. And yet, amid it all, Japan remained orderly, safe, and remarkably cohesive. There were no riots, no populist revolutions, no mass unrest. It was, in many ways, the quietest crisis in history. The world had plenty of time to learn from Japan, but it often didn't. When European nations faced their own crisis after 2008, debt, deflation, slow growth, they fell into political paralysis. When China's real estate boom began to resemble Japan's in late 1980s, some economists sounded alarms. Few listened. And in the United States, debates over debt ceiling and inflation echoed Tokyo's old dilemmas. How much is too much intervention? How does stimulus become addiction? Japan's shadow stretched long, not because others copied its mistake, but because its story revealed something universal. That once an economy built on growth slows down, it's not just the numbers that shrink, it's the sense of possibility. Through it all, Japan endured. The last decade reshaped not only its economy, but its culture. The relentless drive of the post-war years gave way to something quieter, a society that values stability over ambition, sustainability over excess. The work ethic remained, but dreams became smaller. Security replaced risk. And yet, there was resilience in that humility, a grace in persistence. When the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami struck, followed by the Fukushima nuclear disaster, Japan's calm, collective response stunned the world. There were no riots, no looting, only quiet order and discipline. And compassion. The lost decades had not broken Japan. They had, in a strange way, prepared it, teaching endurance, patience, and perspective. Today, the world looks increasingly like Japan once did. Aging populations, slow growth, mountains of debt, central banks trapped at zero. The Japanification of the global economy once a warning, is now a shared condition. And as the 21st century unfolds, Japan's experience no longer seems as failure, but as prototype. In a world where permanent growth may be impossible, Japan is showing what comes after, how a nation survives, even thrives, without expansion, without revolution, without collapse. Japan's lost decades began as an accident, a burst bubble, a stumble of greatness. But in hindsight, there was something more, a slow reckoning with modernity itself. They forced a nation to confront questions the rest of us are only beginning to ask. What happens when progress stops? When youth no longer believe the future will be as bright as that past? When the system keeps functioning, but the dreams have gone quiet? In those decades of stillness, Japan discovered a strange kind of wisdom, that survival itself can be a form of victory. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of its lost decades. Because sometimes the most important stories are not those who rise and conquer, but those who fall, endure, and learn to live with loss.